should tell people how we met because we
Yeah, I
met
was thinking of that
through.
too. Yeah,
Yeah, we gotta let people know that we met in Kansas City,
yeah,
and it was during a performance of my one-man play about Charlie Parker,
yes.
and we both were part of the festival, the Charlie Parker Festival in Kansas City.
Yeah,
Um,
and I have to tell people how I go. I just I want I was resistant. I was resistant to going to to see your play because I thought, oh, nobody's gonna do Bird. Nobody can do Bird. Nobody can do Bird. And I was so happy that my mother was dead and she wouldn't have to see this. And that's the way I felt, you know. But I said,
hmm.
okay, well, I'll go and I'll go see the play. It's going to be terrible anyways. And
All right. Well, we're here. We're going to talk about you. We're going to talk about your mom's book. I have your mom's book right here. Um, we're going to talk about her. There, you got it too. Let's go.
wow, two
Let's
of us,
go.
the twins.
I know.
Yeah.
And um, okay, let's just get started in it. Your mother, your whole family was very, very, you know, in the entertainment business well before she was introduced to Charlie Parker. Your grandmother was a dancer. Your grandfather was a producer
Yeah,
of
and my
of
grandfather was much older than my grandmother, so he had a head start.
hmm,
So he
hmm,
was in show business way before my grandmother probably was born.
right. I mean, he was producing shows all over New York. He had a with some of the most popular performers in that
Yeah,
time.
yeah, like Mae West and uh, oh, I don't know. I'll remember later, but yeah, top drawer talent, and he had traveling shows too that went on tour across the country, and you know he was a go getter, and he was well respected. People liked him, and they liked being around him. From what I've heard, and I'm sorry that he died. He died in 1932, and my grandmother never remarried. She wore her wedding rings, and until she died, and she loved him.
Yeah, that's love when you keep that ring on
Yeah,
for so many years for the rest of your life and you don't
for the rest
remarry
of
and
her life. Yeah,
yeah, so he was always with her and he
yeah,
was with all of you for that matter. Yeah.
yeah. Well, he sure loved my mom. He died when my mom was just about 7,
Hmm.
and my uncle, my mom's brother, had just was 2, so he never knew his father. But my mother knew her daddy, who doted on her and spoiled her like crazy. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
crazy
Mm-hmm.
spoilage. And he
Mm-hmm.
spoiled my grandmother too, his wife,
Right.
and so when he died, I mean, he lost all his money in the stock market crash, and
Right.
and I mean, she had forgotten what it was to be poor
Mm-hmm.
because she grew up in Iowa, farm girl,
Right. Right.
and she left Iowa when she was 16 and never returned.
Hmm.
basically. And I
Hmm.
mean, she went to Chicago with a friend for the summer, and that was it. She never
Right.
went back. And then
Right.
she went to New York, and then she went into show business when she hit Chicago, and and that was it. That was the birth of our show business in the family, and we were all in show business. Everybody in the family.
Yeah. And still, you are. You're a singer, um, and and it said Gar plays the guitar.
He
Is
plays
that
the
did he play?
guitar, but he's never done it professionally. Uh, uh, my brother
And
Gord
Gar is your
Garsville son.
right. So your brother through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my
Right.
brother Gar and my son Alexander are the only two non-professional
Right.
musicians in the family, and my sister Amy was not professional either. But
Right.
I was the only sibling who was professional
Right. Right.
in
Right.
my immediate family.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Um, any other stories about I remember you just telling me how much you loved your grandmother, and
Yeah.
it's almost as if she raised you in some respect,
Yeah.
at least
When
during
you
certain
when you
part.
said any other stories, all I could see was Pandora's box opening when you said things flying out. My grandmother was a wonder. My grandmother was so much fun. She, I mean, she lived to be almost 98, and the last 3 or 4 years of her life, she had dementia, vascular dementia, because her carotid arteries were blocked, and they couldn't operate on her because she was too old, and she would have died
Right.
during the operation.
Right.
So she wasn't getting blood to her brain, so she had dementia. But
Hmm.
she was so sweet. In her last year, I visited her. She lived in New York City all her life after my mother discovered 52nd Street and jazz and
Right.
bebop. My
Right.
mother moved to New York, Manhattan,
Right.
and then my grandmother followed her into Manhattan and lived in Manhattan, New York, all her life. And
Hmm.
sorry, I'm a little gravelly. And so my Grammy lived in a 5-flight walk-up apartment, 64 steps. But who's counting? I
Right.
counted. I counted every
Obviously.
single time I went up and down those steps. And Grammy, in the last year of her life, I went to visit her from Pennsylvania. I went into New York, and when I say New York, I mean Manhattan. But
Hmm. Hmm.
but she was sitting in her chair, and my grandmother was blind. She started going blind in her early 80s, and she was totally blind. And she was sitting in her chair with dementia and blindness, and she was leaning down, and she said, "Oh, look at all the flowers." And so she was creating this inner life for herself.
Yeah, she
And then
still was alive
she
despite all
still
of
was
that.
alive. And then she was looking at a brick wall, and she said, "Look at all the cars." And we had a friend over, and the friend said, "Oh, Millie, I bet they're all limousines." And Grandma's little eyes, her little dead eyes, lit up, and she said, "I think they are." And and then she saw her mother, and she saw her sisters, and it was such a gift to me to
It,
you know,
Good.
to see end of life.
And to see her still having, something generate her senses, something move her despite, the difficulties she had
Listen,
with being blind and
my grandmother was a Ziegfeld girl,
right.
which was a big deal in the 20s and the early 30s. Florence Ziegfeld had these beauty queens, and they were the tall, statuesque girls. But Grandma snuck off after she was married. She snuck off and auditioned for Florence Ziegfeld and got into the Ziegfeld Follies. And she was on the Midnight Follies, which were up on the roof. And that was a separate show. And my grandfather was initially angry, but he wasn't angry because he. Oh, I meant to take my phone off the hook.
It's okay.
Sorry. Um, um, he wasn't that angry because he flooded the theater with with to kill the phone
Flowers and things like that.
with flowers. Yeah,
Right.
and anyway, so she would go every year that she could. She would go to the Ziegfeld Ball. They would have a ball, and all the people who were still alive would get, go to the ball. It was a big thing where you'd meet your contemporaries and everything.
Right.
So
Right.
she was like 96 or something and still wanting to go to the Ziegfeld Ball. And her friend,
Hmm.
Diane, whom I'm still in touch with, she's about 4 years older than me. Diane got her brother and they carried Grandma down the 64 steps, took her
Wow.
to the ball, and
And
carried
they
her home
had a
64
good time,
steps.
huh? That's great. That's
And
excellent.
that was Grandma's last outing. And she
Hmm.
hadn't been out in a couple of years because of the steps. And that was her last outing. She got to go to the Ziegfeld Ball.
That's wonderful.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
and I mean, your mother Chan grew up around this woman with so much life, her mom, and how do you think that influenced her as a young person to to be in show business? I'm not sure everyone associates your mother with show business. They sort of associate her as as a wife of saxophonists. But your mother was extremely artistic, and like I said, you guys were a big part of show business in New York City. Um,
Yeah.
so, did she share any, or did you happen to hear any conversations between your mother and your grandmother? Because she was a dancer too. Chan was a dancer too, right?
Well, I wouldn't call Grandma a dancer. They just sort of moved around and posed,
Oh, okay,
That it was that kind of dancing. It was like
right,
Trump dancing.
okay,
It's just like, I don't think I don't think they did like too many steps. Um,
right.
but and I don't think my mother did either, although my mother could move. And no, my mother and my grandmother were not alike,
Hmm.
really. But my mother grew up with musicians in the house because my grandmother had had a part-time job in after my grandfather died. She had to work, so she had a part-time job selling real estate, but the market was depressed because of the stock market crash, and
Mm-hmm.
so she had this great big empty Victorian house that was given to her to live in, and it had a piano. So my grandmother's other job was checking coats and hats at the Cotton Club. So my grandmother knew the band. So
Right.
my grandmother never went to sleep before like 6 in the morning in her lifetime after my grandfather died, and probably before that. My
Mm.
grandmother was lived at night, and
Right.
so my grandmother would have, Gene Krupa, Cab Calloway, the Nicholas brothers, whoever was headlining at the Cotton Club. My grandmother would have, if if they wanted to, my grandmother
Right.
would have over to the house after hours all these musicians. So my mother, even as a young child, would would know these people. So
Right.
my mother was fluent, in with musicians.
Exactly. And fluent in
Uh,
jazz.
well, yeah, in burgeoning jazz and music. So my mother had that background, and from there she went to bebop. And when she discovered bebop, that was it. I mean, she just plunged right in. That was it for her.
Right. Right.
My
And
grandmother wasn't. My grandmother could have cared less about bebop. So I mean, they didn't have that kind of rapport. My grandmother and mother, that they talked music. Uh, they
because
just
your mother, your grandmother was more of the swing era type of
Yeah, but they
musician.
didn't get into it. My grandmother was like taking care of me, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was her focus. So
Right.
and her job, and what she had to
Right.
do to keep it together. So they
Right.
weren't discussing music really.
Right.
My grandmother just didn't want too much weirdness in the house, in the
Right.
apartment, because
Right.
they moved. They lived together, uh, off and on, uh, in this wonderful apartment on
Right.
52nd Street, which was Swing Street, and it was
Right.
nothing
Right.
but clubs. And at uh, at 5 years old, I had the run of the street. I
There
would
you
go
go.
out. I would go out and just walk. And if I got
At,
lost, I would go up to a cop and say, "Uh, can you take me home? I'm lost." And he would
and they
say,
take you home.
well, do you know where you live? And I say, yeah, 7 West 52nd Street. And they'd take me home. And they'd say, this little girl is out wandering by herself. And they'd say, oh, thanks for bringing her home. And they'd say, well, you can't just let her wander around. And I'd say, yes, thank you very much. And like, get rid of the cop. But
Mm-hmm.
this happened quite often. And I just wonder, nobody cared. Nobody cared.
Well, it was a different time,
Well, it
and
was a different time. People weren't thinking about children being molested and kidnapped.
did they knew that you were, you know, Chan's daughter, and
Well,
she
no,
was
we
pretty
lived on
popular.
52nd Street. Down on 42nd Street, they didn't know I was Jan's daughter. You know, I
Right.
was, I was out there.
So you were all around. You were
I
not
was
just
all
56.
around. Yeah, I was,
Yeah.
I was, I was blocks from home. But no, on 52nd Street, I was well taken care of.
Right.
All eyes were out on me. They knew
Right.
where I
Did you
was.
ever, were you ever able to actually go into any of the clubs at 5 years old and listen? Did,
No, no, not really. Pincus was the was the doorman for the block,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
Pincus had his eye on me at all times.
Mm-hmm. So
He and I were
he,
like
he
that.
he wouldn't he wouldn't mind you walking up and down the street, but he wasn't going to let you into any of the venues.
No, 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 and I would not have presumed. I always knew my limits.
Right, right.
Yeah,
But you
yeah.
could probably hear the music from the street.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I had my routine down. I knew, I knew what I could do and what I couldn't do.
Hmm.
And I,
What could you do? What were some of the things other than
well,
just walking?
we lived like two houses down from the 21 Club. The
Mm-hmm.
21 Club, I think, is still there. I don't know. But that was a famous restaurant for movie stars.
Oh,
And
okay.
and then there was next to it was Jack and Charlie's, which was
So which movie stars would you come across?
well, I had a scrapbook and people like Linda Darnell. You wouldn't know those people these days, but
Right.
um, it's sort of B list, I would say. But
Mm-hmm.
but my grandmother would give me a quarter every night, and I would walk over to Sixth Avenue to the delicatessen, and I would get a Hires root beer and a pack of two cupcakes, and I would come back, and I would sit on this on the there was like a I don't know what you call it, like um, a thing about
Little,
3.5 feet high. Maybe it was concrete,
right.
it wasn't a
Little
stoop, but
banister or something like that. I
yeah,
know what you're
yeah,
saying.
little
Yeah.
thing. And at
Mm-hmm.
Jack and Charlie's, which was just next door to the 21 Club, and Jack and Charlie's, they were like bootleggers, but they used to be legit. And uh, anyway, they were closed, but I would sit up there with my cupcakes and my root beer, and I watched the people go in. Now, I was allowed to do that because my fake godfather was the doorman at the 21 Club, Red Warner, and he was
Right.
also friends with Saul Hurok, who was Russian. They were all Russians. And he
Right.
was Russian, so was my fake godfather. And Saul Hurok was the great impresario who brought the Bolshoi Ballet to New York City, who brought
Mm.
the Ringling Brothers Circus
Mm.
and
Wow.
the rodeo to New York City. So I got tickets to all of those shows
Mm.
whenever
Mm.
they were in town.
Right.
I
Right.
got the tickets. I
That's
knew
great.
Emmett Kelly, the clown at the circus.
Right.
I mean,
You were in the middle of it, you know,
I
and
was pretty hot stuff. I mean,
you were.
it was pretty special. It was really
Yeah,
pretty special. The,
I believe it.
if photographers came once to the circus, and General MacArthur was sitting like 3 seats back and across the aisle from me, and they
Mm-hmm.
wanted a cute picture of me sitting on General MacArthur's knee, and I said
Wow.
no, no.
Oh, come on, Kim.
No, I refused.
Okay. Well,
I
I
didn't want to
mean,
sit on some man's knee.
he was okay. I understand
I
that,
didn't know
but
him.
oh, well, you didn't know him. Okay, I thought you may have known who he
No, I
was.
didn't know him.
Oh,
Go
okay.
sit on some guy's knee.
Well, that's understandable. You
It's a
know.
bridge too
Uh,
far.
yeah, most definitely.
I could
So
have
I
been
mean, but
contender.
that was quite the environment to grow in. Do you remember anything of the early days of Chan and Bird, like when they were dating? Not so much about just
No,
their.
no. Well,
You don't have any of that,
well, no, no, not really. I wouldn't say that I do. I do remember the. I do remember when we were living with him. I remember those. I remember that very well.
right? You remember the
Um,
first time you saw? Can you remember the first time that you saw
mm,
Charlie Parker?
no,
Yeah.
no, I can't say I could pinpoint it.
Right.
Um, all sort of runs together.
I can understand that. I can understand that.
Yeah.
But when you guys moved in with him, because you moved into his place, right?
Well,
Right.
that was on 11th Street, and I don't remember that place at all.
Oh wow. Okay.
So that was before we lived on Avenue B,
Right.
and 10th Street.
And that's the
That I
historic.
remember very well.
Right. And that's the historic building now. It has a
Yeah,
plaque on it. Right.
yeah, yeah. And I've been
Right.
back to that place.
Right. Yeah, I've seen that, and that's right across. What is it? Right across from Tompkins, something like that.
Tompkins,
Well, that's
Tompkins Street.
yeah.
Yeah,
Right. Where they have the Charlie Parker Festival.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where most of your memories are
yeah.
of.
That's where all my memories are, Bird.
Okay.
Well, except walking with him and being outside of the apartment, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
certain events outside the park.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
And he doted on you very much, like Chan's dad doted on her. Very similar
Well,
type
but
of
except
love.
he did well, yeah, but he didn't he didn't like buy me buy me he didn't buy me love
Right.
like like my mom's dad spoiled her with dresses and you know
Mm-hmm.
that kind of fancy love. He didn't
Mm-hmm.
do that. He
Mm-hmm.
was he brought me back wooden horses from Sweden, and he uh, he brought me things from the magic shop
Right.
on Eighth
Well,
Avenue.
he didn't have the resources, you know.
Well, he brought. I think he brought me things that he liked. Kind of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I get it. I get it. I
He
get
brought
it.
me a rag doll. He brought one for me and one for my sister Pree, and I still have
Right.
mine. It's real beat up, but I hung on to it.
Right.
And
Well, we should tell people how we met because we
yeah, I
met
was thinking of that
through.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to let people know that we met in Kansas City,
Yeah.
and it was during a performance of my one man play about Charlie Parker.
Yes.
And we both were part of the festival, the Charlie Parker Festival in Kansas City.
Yeah,
Um,
and I have to tell people how I just I want I was resistant. I was resistant to going to to see your play because I thought, oh, nobody's going to do Bird. Nobody can do Bird. Nobody can do Bird. And I was so happy that my mother was dead and she wouldn't have to see this. And That's the way I felt, But I said,
Hmm.
okay, well, I'll go and I'll go see the play, but it's going to be terrible. I know it is, and I went crazy for you, like in the first minute. It was
Hmm.
so wonderful,
Wow.
and you had Bird down. You had him down. You had his cunning. You had his cute, and you just had him. I couldn't believe it.
Wow. Thank
I
you.
couldn't believe it. It was like you were possessed.
Well, I had performed the play for quite a few years at that point, and I knew that you were in the audience, but I had decided not to do any research about you or try to find you on the internet so I would know how you look because I knew that would distract me. And I was trying to find you at times in the audience because, I break the fourth wall there.
Right.
Um, and then I thought, I'll forget it, just do the show. Um, but I was hoping you would like it. But at the same time, I knew I just had to do my best. And the Kansas City audience were, always receptive to the play. Um, so it meant a lot that you were there. And it meant a lot, and it still does mean a lot that you enjoyed it.
Well, I was the
And
giggling one up front. I was it's right up front.
I know you were right up front. I remember now as they introduced us after the show, and we've been friends ever since. Um, but I remember that moment, um, and that was one of my most fun performances of it because I was in Kansas City being Charlie Parker, and there
Yeah,
you were
yeah.
in the audience. So I mean, of all the performances I've had, before and since then, I would say that was undoubtedly the most meaningful.
Oh, that's
Um,
sweet.
I mean, how could it have not been? Um,
Well,
and
you were
I've learned
just
a lot. I've learned a lot from you and from that performance, and I really covered our friendship. Um, so that's how this podcast
yeah.
sort of came to be from our meeting. I don't even remember when that was. That was obviously before the pandemic. That might have
Oh,
been, what,
yeah, way before.
2015,
Mm,
2017,
No,
maybe
it was
something
way
like that.
before that.
Yeah, I don't know. It was. You're probably right. Yeah, I don't remember now. It was
I
a good
don't
while.
either.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And then we had the performance there in New York, um, and
right,
Mittens, where
right.
we did some stuff together. You know, um, and that was unique too. But
And
just being
Kansas
in
City was
Mittens,
best. Yeah, I thought.
I agree. Though I agree,
Yeah,
Kansas City show was
yeah.
was better.
You were
Um,
so funny. Oh, you were so funny.
well, thank you again, but it was
Oh,
fun. It was fun doing the show, and I gotta relive that show and get it back. It's been a while, and the pandemic kind of killed that play. Well, it didn't kill it; it slowed it down tremendously. But now I'll try to get it back. Um,
yeah, yeah. You should because there's. I think that people are waiting. You got people waiting out there.
I agree, and it's Bird, you know, and there's nobody like Charlie Parker in the history of music.
That's right.
Um, so I mean, yeah, I will. I will bring it back. I promise.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I do want to get back to something before we got on that topic. Is um, your late sister Pree?
Yeah.
I remember we were talking, I don't know, one of our conversations, and you were talking about how you still think of her, and how you, I believe you had a dream about her or something like that. She died really young. Um,
Yeah. She she was she was slow to develop. Uh, she couldn't walk, and she couldn't really talk. She made
in the next episode of Let's Talk About Sax, Kim Parker talks about her parents, Charlie and Chan Parker. She also talks about her mom's marriage to alto saxophonist Phil Woods and Chan's artistic talents.